behind API Blueprint was to have a document-driven API description language. It was made using the basic, it was used you write API Blueprint specification using Markdown, which is easily readable by humans. So you write API specifications, which are very easy for humans to consume. It was introduced by ApiMatrics in 2013. Finally, we have RAML. RAML, again, is written in YAML format. It has a lot of enterprise support. It is supported by, I can't remember the name right now. The main specialty of RAML is that it was designed not just to document APIs, but also model them. So here we have a little table that shows exactly all the different API specification formats that we have and when they were introduced and what languages do they support. So WSDL was introduced back in 2001, which was basically for SOAP-based API specifications. WSDL 2.0 came in 2017, adding support for RESTful APIs, but not fully supporting it. WADL was introduced in 2005. Swagger was introduced in 2010, followed by RAML and API Blueprint in 2013. In 2014, ApiMatrics also introduced their own API specification format, which uses JSON. So I would like to give just a small example of how APIs are written in different API specification formats. Now, for this particular example, my emphasis is not on exactly how to write them or the technical details, but more about how readable and how easy it is for a layman or a non-professional in this field to look at these API specifications. Now, on the top two, on the left side, we have RAML and Swagger that has been written in YAML. If you can see, this is pretty simple and straightforward. You have a key and a value. So you know, if you can, by just reading this, you know we have the title of our API specification is sample API. It's 1.0 version, and and there's a content to it. Similarly, for Swagger, we have info, which tells us the version number, the title, the description. So even someone who is not accustomed to structured languages or markup languages could look at either of these and get a nice idea on what's going on. Compare this to JSON. In JSON, we have a more structured approach. As we know, in JSON, we have objects and arrays. Now, this might get a bit confusing for some people who are not used to working with JSON or other markup languages and structured languages. It might get a little confused. And going back to the point I was talking about, RAML is supported by MuleSoft. And if you are up to date about the information, today MuleSoft did acquire Salesforce for a whopping $6.5 billion. So there's huge enterprise level support for RAML as well. Now moving on to WADL. WADL is written in XML, and if someone does not have experience working with XML, this might seem very cumbersome and complicated for them. You can't really know what's going on. You have to look at the doc tag and look at the title, which gives you the title of your API specification, and then you have to look at the data here to know the description. So for a non-techie who has never worked with XML, he would not really understand what this API specification is trying to convey. And comparing this to API Blueprint that uses Markdown, it seems like it is a very natural language and a natural way of explaining what the API specification is. We simply tell what the host is, we have a description here, we have a title here, and this becomes very human readable. Even a non-techie company not even a non-techie person could look at this specification and get some information out of this. So now, we have discussed a few different API specifications and what languages they are written in. We would also want to know what advantage for each of this API specification holds. What are the benefits of it? In what case we would want to use them? So let's start with WSDL. As I've talked about, the core of WSDL, WSDL 1.0, the first version, was basically made for SOAP-based APIs. So if you want to write your API, a SOAP-based API specification, then WSDL might be the option for you. Now, WADL is also written in XML. So if your API involves data that is in XML, then WADL might be the right option for you. Also, if you have multiple HTTP methods for the same route like GET and POST, then WADL would be the right choice since OpenAPI and RAML do not support this. On the other hand, if you want a strong community support and you want an open source API specification that is picking up and that's picking up and getting really famous, and there's a strong community behind it, and there are a lot of third-party tools, and OpenAPI is the way to go for you. On the other hand, if you want an enterprise-level solution, then RAML, supported by MuleSoft, is a choice for you. Also, RAML allows you to define libraries containing reusable components. And if you have a team that is not really up to mark with all the different markup languages, or they are not that technically strong, and you want to write an API specification that can be read by a layman or a non-technical person, then API Blueprint written in Markdown is the right choice. But just keep in mind that even though the API specification is very easy for humans to read, it takes a lot more computational complexity to parse it and for the computer to understand it. Now that we have discussed the API specifications, the different types we have, the different languages these are written in, and the advantages of these API specifications, I would like to get to the main point of the presentation of this webinar. What are the best practices for API description? Now, everyone wants that the API description should be of the highest quality that would result in good documentation and good SDKs and code. So what are some good practices that you can follow to make sure your API description does support all of that? Now, whenever you write an API description, for every component that you write, you have an option to add description to it. My first point would be always try to provide as many descriptions for your components as possible. These descriptions go a long way. The code, the documentation that you generate from these API descriptions, API specifications would have these descriptions. It will make your documentation a lot more readable. Also, the code that will generate it from it would also contain the description and will help your developers and programmers to understand what basically the component of your API are trying to achieve. So for example, for your API, it's always nice to give a short description of what basically the API is and what it does. Right here, I have a code snippet for a CodeGen API specification written in Swagger. And you can see we have straight away given a small description that's CodeGen and Transformation as a Service API. And basically, automatically, it is highly customizable, and it is used automatic code and documentation generator for RESTful API. So it automatically generates code and documentation for your RESTful API using your API description. So if anyone wants to read the documents or the code of this API, they would know right away what the main goal and purpose of this API is. Similarly, you have endpoints. It's always nice to give some description to those endpoints as well. In highly complex APIs, you might have hundreds of endpoints, and just going through them via their HTTP method is a get or post or their route, you might not be able to understand what exactly the purpose of this endpoint is. So in that case, it's always nice to give a little description which tells the end user or the programmer that what this endpoint is and what's its use. Similarly, if you are describing any custom models, then the description for those models really help your developers. So we have a validation exception model here. So it's basically the description tells that it's an exception model that contains information, warning, messages, and errors related to those exceptions. So just looking at this description, I can know what the main aim of this model is and what it's trying to achieve. Similarly, your model might have different fields, so just giving what type of the field it is not enough. Let's say I have a field which is Boolean, so I need to know that its value is true or false. That I know of, but what exactly does this true or false value represent? And that we can tell in our description. Here we have a very simple description that says that a Boolean for success in API description. That means that if there was a success in your API, then this Boolean will be set to true or false. But in more complicated case, this description could really help the person understand what this particular value of field could mean. Similarly, we have a list of arrays, an array type known as errors. So the description tells that what are the errors and what list of errors were there in this API description. Again, these are very straightforward examples, but as you have more complex model types and their fields, a good description goes a long way in telling the developer or the person reading your document that what this basically model does. Another thing that you can always do in your API description besides giving it descriptions to your components is you can give examples and samples. Now, for example, my endpoint takes in a certain amount of query parameters. Now, I can pretty much tell if they're required or not and what their type is, but that might not be enough. I give a description to tell what this query parameter basically accepts, and then also an example of the probable values that this endpoint can accept really helps drive your message that what the endpoint parameter is, what it accepts, and what kind of values you can send to it. For example, here we have a query parameter which basically takes the API formats that you want to transform your API to. So this is a quote from our API transformation library, which basically what it does is you can give it an API description in one language, let's say, for example, Swagger, and then you can convert it automatically to some other API specification format, such as RAML. So it takes a value as input, which specifies which API format you want to convert it to. And just as an example, we have to go in RAML. So right away, the developer or the person reading the document knows that what input values this parameter takes. Similarly, if you have, if your endpoint returns a value, then giving an example of what exactly kind of values it returns can really help your developer. For example, if I'm trying to consume your API and I go through the documentation, I get this good example which says the return time is going to be JSON, and this is the structure it has. It has 4 objects. You have a success object, which could be true or false. You have an error list, a warning list, and a list of messages. I know right away what to expect when I call your API, and give success what exact format of return I will get. And then in the front end, I can easily parse it, I can manipulate this data and display it or do some action based on this data, and I would not have to spend too much time figuring out what the type of data, in what format the data is being returned, and how should I manage it. Similarly, if you have model or custom types, always give a sample example of what the model or the custom type might look like. So just compared to our last example, we were returning, so if we return, instead of pure JSON, if we return a model, let's say validation summary, then here we can specify in an example that what exactly this model would look like. So we'll have a success object, an array, which would be errors, which would be a list of warnings, and some message. So this little example just helps us understand really easily what the model can look like and what the model might support. Similarly, when you have model fields, then giving a small example of the messages or what the model field could store is a really good idea. So here we have just a little example of the string type of array, string that can be stored in this array for the given model field. So now we have discussed some basic best practices. There's some more that I would like to discuss as well. So in case you have models or components, it's always best to define them at a global level. So whenever, for example, if you define a model at a global level, anytime you need it, you can directly reference it. It is never a good idea to rewrite the same code. It's always best to write it once and reference it in all further uses of it. So if you have any models or components that might be reused, write them at a global level and reference them in your code instead of writing them over and over again. Similarly, if you have some components, always assign them very user-friendly and easy names. So if you have a model, the name should not be generic. The name should not be something very random. It should be so that when I look at the name of the model, I should get a very basic idea of what this model is and what it's trying to achieve. So a user-friendly name would really help your developers by just looking at the name of the model to know what it does. So always use very user-friendly and easy to understand and intuitive names that will just give you a hint of what this particular component is about. Also, there are some format-specific restrictions in different formats that you need to take into account. For example, there might be some reserved keywords or character. For example, in API Blueprint, we have a list of keywords that are reserved. So you cannot use those keywords in your API specification. Similarly, Swagger does not allow you to use base URI templating. Now, if you have like any of these restrictions in your API specification, now if you try to use any automation tool like the one provided by ApiMatrics to either convert your API specification to SDKs or to automatically generate your documents based on those API specification, you might get some errors if the error was fatal, or you might end up with wrong SDK or documents if you do not take into account these format-specific restrictions. Also, when you have a bunch of different endpoints, it's always a good idea to group those endpoints that are related to each other together. This way, all the similar endpoints are at the same place, and you can just directly go to that. They're grouped together, so you just need to have to look at one place where you can find all your endpoints that are related to each other. Also, if you have some authentication specified in your API description, if you're going to use any authentication, it is always a good idea to clearly mention out what kind of authentication you're using, any additional information you need to pass about that authentication. Specifying that in your API description really helps generate good documents and write amazing code. Now that I have talked about all these good practices, I hope all of you were able to understand them and were able to get some information out of them. I would want to go to a demo where we would show you that even those simple points, such as adding descriptions, can create a huge impact on your results. Like all the best practices that I discussed so far are pretty simple and straightforward. And it might not seem that they will pay such a huge impact, but with my demo, I will be able to show you that just adding descriptions and examples could make your documentation so much better for your developers and can make your code also much more easily readable. So if everyone has been everyone has been up to date so far, I can move on to the demo. So with me here, let me just go to my demo folder. I have two API specifications. One that follows the best practices that we mentioned, and one that does not. Let me just open this up. So my computer seems to be lagging a bit, but yeah, here we go. So this is a chunk of the API specification that we have written for our code generation engine. And you can see in the best practices, as I described, we straight away have a description for our API. Similarly, whenever we have an endpoint, we give it a nice little description. We also have description for our parameters. And for the response, we not only have descriptions, but samples and examples as well. Similarly, if we go down to our enums, you can see each enum has a name and a description, which basically drives the message what this enum is about. And if I go further down into our models, so the validation summary model, it has a title, a nice little description, and an example of what the end result of this model could be. Similarly, for every field of this model, we have a description and an example. And what the type it is, similarly for warning, we have a description and an example. So all the good practices of writing good descriptions and examples, all of those have been followed here in this document. Though if we go to the one where we did not really follow these practices, you can see we have no description, we have no examples, and even though this would generate SDKs and this would generate documents, so there's no there's no fatal errors with these, or this wouldn't crash, that would still work, but the end result might not be as good as we want. And I can show you that based on, give me a minute, let me just open my, So I'm here on my ApiMatrics dashboard account. So what ApiMatrics lets you do is that if you have an API specification in any of the formats we have discussed so far, you can either transform them from one format to the other, or you can also import them and automatically with a click of a button generate really nice user documents and generate SDKs in a whole bunch of different languages. I'll get to that later on. And if you want to learn more about our product and the services we offer, you can come sign up on our website, that is apimatrics.io, and we can set you up with a nice demo with our developers, and they will walk you through the whole product and what exactly can you achieve with this. But for this particular webinar and demo, I would just like to import these API specifications that I showed. So see, all of these formats we support. We support ApiMatrics, Gradle, Swagger, Raml, API Blueprint, Google Discovery, Match. So we support a whole bunch of different specifications. So I'll just go ahead, take the best practice API specification that we have, and click on import. It would just show me a warning here that we have a model message, which also has an attribute called message. Now, some specifications do not allow this, but for the purpose of this particular demonstration, it's good enough. So as simple as that, we are done, and a simple API, sample API with best practices has been imported. All we need to do is click on generate, select the version, proceed. It gives us the same warning again. And we proceed, and now we have the option to either create an API portal for your developers with the documentation or download the SDK. First of all, I would like to look at the portal and show you how a good API specification can create a good portal. So let me just customize this. Add a logo just to make it look good. You know, always want your documents to look good, and click on publish. So again, ApiMatrics gives you an option that either you can host your documentation you can host your API documentation with us, so we'll host it for you, or you can have your own domain name, and we can use white label. So for this demonstration, I would just like to host it. It asks you to give it a name, so demo good practice. There we go. Clicking on done, and as simple as that, our API portal has been published. So I would like to do the same thing with the API description that did not follow the best practices. So just click on import, close, generate, proceed, read. We want to deploy it to the portal. We want to customize and publish it. Again, give it a nice little logo, save it, and publish it. Again, host it on ApiMatrics. So demo, let's give it whatever name we want. Doesn't really matter. It's not available. That will not go track. So yeah, So someone already has a dog by the name of demo not good. Yeah. Anyway, so there it is. It has been posted. And now we can just compare these documents. So right away, you can see the one where we had a description for an API shows a description here. So right away on your portal, you know what your description can be about. So let's click on Get Started on both of them. So this is the one where we followed all those good practices. We added descriptions, we added examples. So right away, you have some how to get started. So this is part of the documents, the portal that we offer. Again, if you want to know more about our portal, how to deploy them, what features there are, sign up with ApiMatrics.io and we'll set up a demo for you. But what's more interesting at the moment is I would like to go to this endpoint, validate get to. Let me open this endpoint on both of these documents. So here we have the sample API without the best practices. You can see the endpoint has all the necessary code. You know how to call this endpoint in the SDK. You know what parameter it takes. You know it's of a type string, but you don't really know much about this parameter. What exactly is description URL? Also, you have been told that you are returning a model type, but the response is a model type. But what exactly can we expect from this model? Now, if we go back to the one where we added descriptions, where we added examples, you can see right away there's a description of your endpoint. So this tells us that this endpoint can be used to validate an API description documents on the fly. So basically, if you have an API description using this endpoint, you can validate it. And right away, just reading one line of it, I have understood the major purpose of this API endpoint. Again, now I have a description URL, which is a string, which is of type string, but now we also have a description. This is the absolute public URI of an API description document. So basically, the document that you want to validate, the URI of that particular API description. So straight away, I know what parameters this particular endpoint takes. And in response time, it gives me this nice little example of what I can expect from the endpoint as form of a response. It still says what model type it is, but it gives you an example. So just looking at this, I exactly know what for this SDK, if I want to call this particular endpoint, what exactly do I need to pass to it, and what would it return to me in case of a failure or a success. So when I look at this document, I might have to experiment around to see what response I'm going to get. But with this document, right away, I have a very clear understanding of what's happening. Similarly, if we look at our models, so there's a little description here. And it also tells the fields are error and what the field actually holds. So you have all these nice descriptions that tell you that it's a list of string, but what exactly goes in this list. Though if we look at the one where we did not have the right practices, you'll see that there are no descriptions here. And it's, even though the names are quite self-explanatory, but in case they were more complex, you wouldn't really know what exactly this list is supposed to store. Also, on our console over here, you will see that we have a sample of this model, but they have been filled by placeholder values that we generate on our own, since no example was given. But if you gave an example, the console will also show the example, which depicts this model in a much better way. Similarly, for enums, if we look at SDK templates, you get good description of all your SDK, all your enums, that what does this enum stand for and what value does it represent. While if you did not have this description in your API specification, you will be left with blank description and you'll be scratching your head trying to understand what CS Portal NetLab is. Now, I know these are very simple examples, but as a developer, ask yourself, would you rather have nice documentations with descriptions and examples, or would you rather have documentations where you're trying to read the name and trying to figure out exactly what's happening? So just this goes to show you that with very simple steps, such as adding descriptions and examples, which will not take too much time, you make documents that are so much better and so much easier to understand, and your developers will definitely thank you for it. Now, going back to it, so API specification it not only makes a difference to your documentation, but there's also a difference to your code. So as I said, with our tool, you can not only create your API portal, but you can also download your SDK in a whole bunch of languages. So I click on download SDK, and I have this list of languages that we support. You can create an Android SDK or a .NET, Java, iOS, Angular, Ruby, Python, PHP, JavaScript, or Go. So you have this list of 12 languages that we support, and with a click of a button, you can generate your SDKs in them. So let's just select .NET for our case and just go with .NET Standard. And it processes it for a while, and there we go. Our SDK has been generated. So let me just move these SDKs to a new folder. Let's say new SDKs. Make them more easy. So this is the one SDK without the best practices. And similarly, if we take the SDK with best practices, click on generate, proceed, download SDK, .NET Standard. This will generate the SDK with the best practices. We just save them, and here we go. This is the SDKs that I just downloaded from the ApiMatrics code generation portal. Let me just extract them to separate folders. And here we have ready to use SDKs. So, okay, I think I've made a mistake. I have downloaded the best practice SDK twice for some reason. Let me just delete this. Let me just delete all of these and generate them again. Sorry about that, just in a hurry. So let me just download this one. So sample API with best practices. And I need sample API without best practices. Download, and yes, sample API without best practices. So yeah, here we go. We have both the SDKs that we downloaded. We will just extract them here to separate folders. So we have ready to use SDKs. Let's just open the one with best practices. We have a solution here, so we can just click it and open it in Visual Studio. So if you can see, if we go to our controller, what we can see is that the description that we added in our API specification are not only added to the documentation, but to our code as well. Right above your controller, you have the summary, which tells what this controller basically does. And also you have information about the parameter. So what the name of the parameter is, it is required, the description of the parameter over here. So even if someone is going through your code to understand what the SDK basically does, this little summary and these little comments can help him understand, help them understand what basically the endpoint does. And it also tells you what the return type is, it's a model. So for all our endpoints, we have this nice little documentation here, which really helps the developer understand right away what this endpoint does and what values you can expect. Similarly, if we go to our models, we right away have the same descriptions. The field holds value for public properties. Then we have a list of errors in API description. For each property, it tells what these properties are. So those small descriptions in your API specification can really make your code a lot more readable for someone new. So someone new comes into the team and tries to look at your SDKs, he would have a much easier time understanding them. Similarly, if we open an enum, all of them contains the description that we specified. So just looking at the enum name, you know right away what value does this enum represent. So just as I said, very simple things make your code and your API description so much better. So if we go in the one without the best practices, and we open the controller here, the same controller, you will see that there's a placeholder for the description, but it was never given in the API specification, so there's nothing here. Similarly, so there is no example given. So right away, looking at this, you'll have to go into the code to try to understand what this particular endpoint does and what kind of values does it return. And the same thing happens to your enums. There's a placeholder that tells you that you did not mention your description. So you basically have no description for these endpoints. So for me as a programmer, I would much rather have these I would much rather have this amount of code where all these things are nicely documented that I would like to work with. So if I came into a team or if I downloaded an SDK that I want to use, I would really love to have these small summaries and these small descriptions and these small examples that would really help me understand and really help me get the grasp of this code. So that is what we wanted to discuss. I hope you liked the presentation. Now, the takeaway point that I would try to impart in this particular presentation was that writing good API specifications and descriptions is really important. And there are very small things you can do to make your API specifications better and easier for people to read. And the more time you spend in creating your API specifications and making them better and adopting to these good practices, the better the code that will be generated out of these API specifications will be, and the better the documents will be. So so in this case, and like now you have a lot of tools out there that let you write there are a lot of tools out there that let you transform your API specification to code and documentation automatically. So it's much better that you spend more time writing your API specification and then use a tool like the one provided by ApiMatrics, the code generation engine, to convert those API specification directly into SDKs and documents. And with these good practices, the documents that you generate out of this API specification or the SDKs and the code that you generate would be easy to use, would be easy to understand, and anyone that uses it, your users or your own development team would have a much better time working with your code and your APIs. So follow the best practices, always provide descriptions for your different components. It's best to provide examples, learn about different API specification formats, come to know what is best for you and use that, and spend your time. Try to create a good API design, spend your time writing your API specification, and offload your document or code generation to a service like ApiMatrics, which automatically does it in a few seconds. Now, I see that I have a bunch of questions that have been sent my way. So, okay, let me just go through it. So the first question I got is, which new format is suited for converting WSDL to? So if I can, let's see, go back to my presentation here. Let me see where my presentation is. There we go. So yeah, so I have all these API specifications here. So WSDL was basically made for SOAP-based APIs. Now it depends on whether your API is SOAP-based or is it a RESTful API that was written in WSDL 2.0. Now, if it is SOAP-based, then the slight problem is when if you move away from WSDL to some other API format, such as WADL or OpenAPI or RAML, your API will be moved from SOAP-based to RESTful. And in that process, you will lose some information. A lot of things don't map when moving from SOAP to RESTful. So moving from a WSDL to some other format does have its drawback, that you lose some information, and the SDK you might generate from them might not work. Your parameter location might not map properly, and there are other things that might not map. So the good way to go about this is that you can use WSDL to convert from, you can use our transformation to convert from WSDL to, let's say, OpenAPI or RAML, and will not give you a fully working API description, will not give you a fully working SDK, but that is a very good starting point. You convert it into, let's say, an OpenAPI or WSDL or RAML, and generate, and that specification would be a nice starting point for you to start working from there, and then completing your API specification and start adding things that were able to map. So there's a bit of complication when moving from WSDL to some other API format. The next question I have is, which API description is best in your opinion? Now, in my opinion, this is a very subjective question. It depends what you are trying to what you're trying to achieve here. If you're trying to write a SOAP-based API and you want to write a specification for that, then go ahead and use WSDL, because that was made for SOAP-based APIs. But if you're going for more RESTful service or more modern kind of services, then you have a lot of options. It purely depends upon you what your priorities are. If you want a more enterprise level kind of format, which is supported by big organizations such as RAML, which is supported by MuleSoft, then RAML might be your choice of option. Or if you want to write your API specification in XML, then you might want to go with WSDL. Or if you want an API specification format that has huge open community support and is up and growing, OpenAPI seems would be the right choice. And if you want, if your API is not going to be consumed at a large scale, or you want the specification to be small and simple and readable by other humans, non-technical people, then API Blueprint is the way to go. So I just circle back to the point that it is very subjective. It depends on what your goals are, what your team capabilities are, how much you want to spend on learning a new markup language. But if I was given an option, and at this point, and if I wanted to create a API that would be consumed by a lot of users, and I wanted to write a really robust and correct API specification, and I was jumping in new into the whole thing, I would go with OpenAPI because it falls under the Linux Foundation. It is an open source platform, and there's a lot of support. It's easier for new users to jump into. So seeing how huge the support for OpenAPI is at the moment, I would definitely go with that. So the next question I got was, is it a good idea to generate an API description from, say, my C# code in terms of good practices? I would disagree with that. So you do have options to generate API specifications out of your code. You can use annotations, and there are tools available out there that let you do that. But those tools never really create API specifications that are complete. You might have some missing values. There might be some mapping issues. So when we talk about best practices, it is always recommended not to do it. It's always recommended against it. The right flow is that you create an API specification and then create or generate code from it. Doing it back way is not always the most supported way. So if you're starting new and you haven't written any code yet, I would greatly encourage you to first write your API specification and then either automatically generate your code using some tool, or then write the code yourself. But if you already have a huge code that exists, then you can use some tools to generate an API specification out of it, but you will have to spend time to make sure that API specification is correct and everything has mapped properly and everything works. So you can't just like hope that you'll give a code and your API specification will be perfect. So unless you already don't have, if you have a huge code, then okay, not the best practice, but you have to do, like, you might have to adopt that solution, but I would recommend against it. Okay. Yes, you have your own ApiMatrics format as well. Tell me more about it. It's a good idea to maintain your format from start. So, so I have a question that we have our own ApiMatrics format, and they want to know more about it. And is it best to maintain your format from start? How does it benefit me? We have our own ApiMatrics format, which is JSON based. And the reason we have this own format is to have uniformity across our system. So whatever specification we get, we do map them to our own format. So we do not have, so that just makes it easier on our developer end to have one specific format that we have to cater with. So whatever API specifications we do get, we map them to our format. So starting with your own format, if you want to, for example, create a bigger system where you're trying to generate code out of that format, you might want to use your own format because you get to control it, but it is a lot of work standardizing it, making sure it it wasn't easy to come up with our own format. We had to make sure that our format supports everything that all the other formats support. So some formats, as I said, that Vadel does not support, Vadel supports multiple HTTP methods for the same route, but OpenAPI and RML doesn't. But our format had to support it as well because we support Vadel. So making sure a format that encompasses everything is... So yeah, our teammates are trying to document this webinar as well for our later newsletters and stuff. Yeah, so that was our member Sharek there. He didn't even wave. Anyways, getting back to it. So yeah, writing your own format is a huge cumbersome task unless you have a higher end goal that you want to achieve, like we did. We wanted to provide code generation as a service. For that, we needed our own format. I would dive into it. Otherwise, there are like OpenAPI or RML or Vadel. They already exist. They are highly mature. So it's for smaller tasks, for just writing your API specification, it's much better to rather use a format that already exists. So, and also our API format is not that easily human readable. We do want to make it more generic, and so people in the future would be able to write the API specification in it. But as I said, creating your own API format is quite a cumbersome task, and it's not recommended unless you want to achieve something higher or bigger. So. Some other questions have also been answered in chat. So our team is working on trying to answer all your questions. So look at the chat window to your right, and some of the questions have been answered over there. So we have a question. Okay, so we have a very interesting question, quite keen observation from Maria, who asked that why USDK generation 2 replaces model name with generalized object names. For example, include request gets replaced by data 29. It also was mentioned earlier that methods such as guest and post cannot be combined except for WSDL specs. Can you? So for your first question, so the reason that our code generation actually replaces the model name is because in your file, if you have embedded models instead of declaring them globally, and there are some conflict, then what our code generation does is that it appends numbers in front of them in the runtime to cater for it. So this is basically done to avoid conflicts. So as I said, it's always the best practice to specify the models globally so we can avoid such conflicts and reuse them. So in case there is a potential conflict and the models have been embedded, our code generation, sorry about that. Our code generation appends number to it to cater for any particular conflict that we might have down the road. And the other question Maria asked was that if you have get methods for same route, then they cannot be mapped in yeah. Let me look at the question here. Sorry, mentioned that earlier that methods such as get and post cannot be combined except for. So yeah, so if you have, let me just share the screen again. Yeah. we come back to this slide again. If you have some method like guest and post, which are mapped, you have multiple get or post methods mapped to the same route, then only Weddle supports that. OpenAPI at the moment, it cannot be mapped that for the same route, let's say ABC, as you have mentioned in your example, you have multiple get methods for that route. They cannot be mapped in OpenAPI. Weddle at the moment does support that, but OpenAPI does not. So that was, I hope that answers your question, Maria. If you want any further clarification, we can always take this offline, and I can link you up with some of our API specification experts, and I'm pretty sure they can answer your question in a lot more detail and help you understand it in a lot better way. So do you have any further questions from the chat? So I've been told that all the questions were either answered in the chat or there are no outstanding questions. On that note, I would like to thank everyone that joined us today. You took time out of your busy schedules. I know everyone is extremely busy nowadays with work and everything, and you attended this webinar, and I'm extremely grateful. I hope I was able to help you out to some extent, and I was able to impart some information to you that would really help you out in your future. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar. It helped you learn something new, and you will take this knowledge and implement it in your professional life, and you'll see some good results out of what you learned today. On that note, again, the whole point of this webinar was to discuss API specification formats and what good practices can be used to improve your formats. And we did a small, very basic demo. We did not want to make it too long, so we did a very basic demo to show you that how adding description examples could actually make your code more readable. So again, spend your time, learn about API specification, learn about different formats, try to know what the restrictions are, what their pluses are, then select a format, API specification format, and try to spend as much time as you can. The right way is to write a good API specification so you can write a good code and have good documentation. So, and again, you have a lot of tools out there that lets you convert your API specification from one format to another, or it helps you write code. It helps generate automatic code for your SDKs or generate automatic API portals and documentation, as we showed. And we at ApiMatrics do offer this service that based on your API specification, we can generate SDKs in 12 languages, and we can generate an API portal that gives you everything from information about your endpoint, your examples, how to get started, how to import the SDK, and everything. Again, if you want to learn more about ApiMatrics, or if you have some general question regarding the API space, feel free to contact us. You can always visit us on our website, that is apimatrics.io, and you can come up, you can sign up with an account. We have a lot of features that we can offer you. Or if you want to contact us, you can always, we have a contact form on our website as well, with which you can contact us. So thank you, everyone. Hope you had a great time, and I will be signing out now. And we'll be having future webinars as well. I hope you had signed up to our newsletter, so you stay up to date. Or of course, you can message us that you want to sign up to our newsletter, so we can tell you all the latest updates about ApiMatrics and any future webinars that we have coming up. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and have a great evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Thank you.